So let me start with this, and I think Sara sort of touched on it a little bit. She talked about what about the places where there could be journalism sort of deserts because they're not going to be able to do what it takes to perhaps drive digital subscriptions. I think it comes back to data. We heard about data scientists, data analytics, and so forth. Talk a little bit about, each of you all, what is the importance of data analytics? Does it get into AI, machine learning? What needs to happen for any large or small news media company that's local to drive these digital subscriptions? How are they using data? Sara, anybody who wants to start?
Well, I think the challenge is large organizations today. We can invest in data, and we can invest in the technology needed to drive it, and we can hire the data scientists that we need to analyze it. I think when we talk about news deserts, I think the barrier to entry there is going to be, can they get the technology and the expertise to really start to understand it? That's where I think projects like, INMA and Lenfest are so important to that effort, because the more they can share that information out and sort of lower that barrier to entry, so that maybe they can't be the New York Times, but they can at least figure out what the best practices are to get a little start. So things that, give me hope in that are like the Billy Penn's and the Incline Spirited Media's efforts, where they really could start to do some journalistic efforts. Now they're doing it in big metros, but can you take a model like that and move it into a small community and just be able to fund a couple of reporters who can then sort of start to shut down those news deserts? I think that's important.
David, what can companies with much less resources in the New York Times, what can we do? What should we be doing?
I think we oftentimes talk about being data informed, and I think just being able to use the data as a way to uncover insights about your readers. It sounds pretty simple, but really trying to get a handle on what resonates with them and what's important. And then I would just say more broadly, I think that there's something really interesting that in some ways the print product was more personalized than the digital experience. Most people, they pull out their phone, they're on the home screen, or you go to a desktop, you're on the home page. And I think there's just a lot of opportunity to unlock the journalism and the value that's oftentimes buried, that if you're coming back once a day, you might miss. The New York Times publishes 250, 300 stories a day. Most people only see a fraction of that. So how do you get the right stories to the right people?
Most of the news executives and media executives that I talk to tell me that they're awash in data, and the question is how to derive intelligence from the data. There are a couple of data points that kind of need most focus. One is, what does a regular reader look like? The way to get subscribers to subscribe, or readers to turn into paying subscribers with a meter or a freemium model, is to get them to come back to your site 5, 10, 15 times in a month. That's where the meter triggers. So we spent a fair amount of time with the Philadelphia Inquirer, with our other Night Lenfest table stakes newspapers, looking at what does a regular user look like. And if you can isolate that type of person and their habits from a data perspective, you know at least whom you're targeting. That represents a shift from getting as many page views and eyeballs as possible to as many engaged users. And that really has been the secret of the New York Times. Not so secret. You have great engagement.
Yeah.
The second data point is under the category of, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. I think we should be thinking about how many digital subscribers or how much user support a given news organization like the Dallas Morning News or the New York Times need to transition fully to digital. So if a metropolitan newspaper has a $20 million newsroom, they need about 100,000 paid digital subscribers at about $200 a piece to purely support that effort. This was sort of the core math that you were talking about.
Right.
And it's rare that you talk to a news organization that says, we have 20,000 subscribers digitally, but the goal is 100,000 or 200,000 by such and such a date. So having a clear path and a clear goal defined by data is, I think, the second half of that.
Earl, I want to switch for a second. You talked about the Scandinavian newspaper that has an editor in charge of their paid digital subscription growth. Talk a little bit about that culture and what that felt like, and then I'd like to come back to the panelists and say to this question I think Sara and others brought up. Are journalists going to be valued based on the number of digital subscribers that their content, from the Dallas Morning News, Mark Francis Cuddy, where are you, Mark? Mark, wherever Mark is, he knows right now how many digital subscribers have converted off every single individual reporter's reporting. Yet we're not exactly publishing that. So what does this mean to journalists?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question because hearing some of the answers, I wanted to touch on the cultural part. I think the cultural piece of this, why do you put the editor in charge of digital subscriptions? It's to send a signal. It's clearly to get the newsroom behind these changes because, I know throughout our membership network, major newspapers around the world, you've got newsrooms that want nothing to do with this data revolution, nothing to do with digital. That's someone else, that's another department's job. And what we're seeing in Scandinavia generally is they've succeeded, especially in the last 3 to 5 years, in getting their newsrooms on board. Dagens Nyheter takes it to the next level by actually putting their editor personally in charge. And, you want to motivate a newsroom. When the person in charge is personally in charge of it, he would walk us out to the newsroom and boom, here are the KPIs that are behind his goals. And you could talk to his staff, and it was clearly being pushed down, just like it was pushed down at the Globe and Mail, by the way. You're seeing just smarter, you talk about Mark, what we're seeing more and more are enablers, people, translators, people who can see the data and then communicate it to rank and file newsroom people. I think what separates Scandinavia from the rest of the world is just the totality of the cultureship, the depth inside of newsrooms, and it's a different ballgame. I had the honor, Aftenposten did their morning editorial meeting in English for me, at which it was just a 15-minute meeting, but in the 15 minutes, I'd say 10 of those 15 minutes were spent on, subscription triggers, page views, audience, propensity to be shared on social media, really smart talk about what this morning's content did for the business.
I agree with all of that, but I would add that in most newsrooms we found that journalists and editors really have embraced and are excited about the change from spots and dots and eyeballs and delivering mass audience to advertisers to that of engaging their best users, their best subscribers. And that is not a kind of a foreign idea, but a return to the original purpose and excitement of their journalism, which is to generate an audience and get feedback.
David, because you mentioned right at the beginning about sort of the, advertising was never really connected directly to the journalism, and so I assume you're in favor of all this, and that's throughout the Times?
Yeah, I'm not close enough to the day-to-day operations within the newsroom to speak directly to that, but I can say to echo what Jim's saying, I think it's exciting to create something worth paying for, which is different than creating something that hopefully some advertiser will be interested in advertising against. And I think that's something that everybody can rally around. And then it's about finding the right level of clarity and transparency for the journalists and editors so that they can understand how to maximize the impact of their work without having them over-rotate on the data.
So what if the thing I always think about is the City Hall story? It checks a lot of the boxes, but it might not ever check the sufficiency box of turning people into digital subscribers. But it's important to the community. You feel a responsibility to. How does that, though? What happens if those stories don't wind up driving enough conversions, but you might feel it's a part of the mission of the news organization?
Well, I think that's a real challenge. We found when we reorganized a lot of our beats to try to be more reader-focused, and we tried to take our state, we're the state capital, so we tried to take our state government coverage and change it so that We thought it would be more reader-focused, and what we found was it didn't move the needle at all, and nobody was reading the stuff. So, we're coming to two realizations. One is, yes, there's important journalism that you have to do that may not trigger audience, but the other is we also have to keep experimenting with that coverage and how we're telling those stories. And perhaps we just haven't found the right voice or the right methods for telling those kinds of stories. And perhaps we're still not completely reader-focused to understand how do you make a state government budget interesting? Because it's important, but it is not the first thing people are going to click on. So I think there's two parts of that. And if I can also speak to that cultural piece, I think the other piece on this moving journalists to be very connected to those buying activities has brought a whole different hope into newsrooms. Think about prior to this evolution, all journalists are thinking about is print is declining, my newsroom is getting smaller, there's empty desks everywhere. I have this sense of doom and no future. We're just winding down to the waterline. When in comes this idea of you have control of your audience, you can connect, and now not only that, you have control of funding your own organization. It has brought enthusiasm and hope and excitement into newsrooms that didn't have that previously.
And the transparency of data is so important to motivating journalists, editors, et cetera. I mean, I was a journalist 35 years ago. I mean, I'll pick on Jim because you're sitting next to me. Jim, congratulations on that article this morning. You know, we got 1,000 more eyeballs for that J.C. Penney's ad. I mean, that doesn't motivate. That doesn't motivate me. And there's something pure about what's happening here, and I think that's the revolution. It literally is. It's a reader revolution, subscriber revolution, but it's a newsroom revolution.
Absolutely.
Jim, but I'm going to go to the audience right after this, but not for profit. Look, we talked about the Texas Tribune, and it's probably the best model I've seen across the country in terms of actually going from a few people to continuing to scale up. What can nonprofit sources really do for metropolitan, large, medium-sized newsrooms, even small? What can it do? What should it be doing? How can we be accessing it? Everybody here in the room who has philanthropic sources in their communities, in their countries?
The nonprofit model in Philadelphia is first and foremost a way of reaching out to the community, saying this is a cherished community asset. It's a great city deserves a great newspaper. You support the art museum. You support the orchestra. You are concerned about schools, the opioid crisis, support the newspaper. And that is, I think, there's a unique set of circumstances. First was a billionaire benefactor who saw it this way. The second was the fact that the Inquirer had regrettably been through 7 different hands in 7 or 8 years. So this was, the stars kind of lined up in that particular city. The notion that local families, including yours, or local investors in Boston or Minneapolis or now hopefully Los Angeles can support the local newspaper as a for-profit, I think that's equally valid. There's something about a local owner who is in it for the right reasons that is the core. The capital structure and the legal structure around non-for-profit, I think, is really secondary to those things.
Okay. Let's open it up for questions, and I can come back to the group with some if we don't have. But how about questions from?
There are mics on both sides.
Yeah. So, can somebody help me here? I can't see too well. So, questions? RB, please.
Yes. Hi, I'm RB Brenner. I'm the director of the journalism school here. And one thing I haven't heard you talk about is for about 8 years I've been teaching, and I ask students, raise your hand if you do.
The mic's not working.
I don't think so.
Is it not?
I ask them, raise your hand if you do any kind of destination news. Forget subscriptions, just going regularly to a website, and there's a scattering of hands. I ask them how many just get your news on some form of social media platform. What's in your Twitter feed, what's on your Facebook page, and most of the hands go up in the room. And I'm not convinced that it's just a generational thing. I think it's a lot of people. So with that, how do you then begin to even change that habit so people can move down your spectrum to actually be an engaged customer?
You want to start with this one?
I think we appreciate we're never really going to get them to come to our homepage. So people who still talk to us about, oh, but the homepage needs to be this, it needs to be that, like, well, okay, but nobody's really coming to the homepage. So the idea is, how can we get you to connect with some of our other products that are probably more push-oriented, that will help us get a closer relationship with you? Or can we get you to follow us on Twitter, and can we use Twitter then to push you to an email newsletter? And can we use the email newsletter then to help you understand that by having fuller access to our complete suite of products that are digital, will that move you in? And we're even working with sort of our older core loyal audience to try to pull them from print to our replica e-edition, which they seem to like, and then can we get them to Facebook? So I think that we just have to use every product to try to keep bringing you closer and closer and get you into some of our...
I just think your challenge there is a lot of them don't even know that it was your story.
Right.
Because there's so much stuff coming through that pipe.
Yeah, it's a challenge, absolutely.
I know when we released our Path Forward, one of the statements we made is that we wanted to be the best news destination in the world. And so I think it was a very conscious choice to say we want people coming directly to us. That doesn't mean that everybody needs to, and that most people will still come through side channels and Google, Facebook, Twitter, you name it. And so, it's through thinking about things of how do we make that news browsing experience truly unique and compelling? How do we get people hooked on the idea that there's more compelling stories that they're missing if they don't come? It's about thinking about things like, hey, during the big stories and the big moments, how do we convince people the Times is where you go to actually read, whether it's election results or a hurricane or whatever that might be. And I think that said, it's also little tactics like how do you get people hooked on the newsletter or following you on Facebook? And so I think it's about thinking about all of those things. But ultimately, if you're going to have a subscription business, you have to believe that people are going to want to have you on their home screen or a tap away. Otherwise, the relationship is going to be with the platform.
A question right here?
Yeah. Henrik Ornebring from Karlstad University, Sweden. I think you can hear me, right?
We are broadcasting to millions of people all over the world.
No pressure.
So no pressure, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, Earl, great to hear you talking about Sweden. I get this feeling that you get when they mention your hometown on TV. But one thing that you were all saying, that Sara was saying it, David was saying it, Earl was saying it, was that the newspaper was always more than news. It was the crossword puzzle, the recipes, the classified ads, everything. And Earl mentioned, there's a lot of things that you can sell that trigger subscriptions. If you're an infrequent user, you want summaries. If you're a news junkie, you want the in-depth stuff. And this strikes me, this is like a return to the newspaper business model of 100 years ago, the omnibus newspaper, which had a little bit of everything for everyone. And just 5-10 years ago, in panels like this, people would much more talk about that model is dead. It's a fragmented audience. People want specific things. What's the magic bullet content that we can give people? Is in-depth news the magic bullet? Is sports the magic bullet? And now all of a sudden you're or maybe not all of a sudden, but now you're talking about, no, we have a lot of everything, so we can sell this thing to this group and this thing to this group. What changed?
Well, I don't know that anything really changed, except that I think the data, we're not really trying to be everything to everybody, but the data allows us to understand what are the content pieces that our audience is connecting with. And that could be, we know in Raleigh that there's a lot of the national news and there's a lot of the NFL sports that does not connect with our audience. So we just aren't going to do that. There's a lot of arts reviews, theater reviews that in our market, nobody's going to read them, so we don't do them. But what we will do is anything that connects with an audience. So it seems like disparate content, but it's really just watching the data and understanding those are the things that are connecting.
I think there's a difference between the view that the newspaper is the newspaper of record in a given city, that it has to cover everything, that it's all things to all people, the general store, and the view that there's only a small handful of key content categories that really, really matter. Most newspapers that are selling digital subscriptions successfully have 4 or 5 major franchises. The investigative news, enterprise news that people care most about and that most influences the city. It sometimes doesn't have the page views and the traffic that sports would have. Sports is almost always another major category. In Philadelphia, to our maybe not surprise, but our delight, the food coverage has an enormous amount of traffic. So it's really, I think, about focusing in on 4 or 5 big franchises that drive traffic, as opposed to believing that we're all things to all people.
The number one question I get on the road in the last 6 months is, how many newsletters does a typical newspaper have? And the first time I got the question, I was just caught flat-footed. That's either the dumbest or most brilliant question I've ever heard. And then I kept getting it over and over and over, and it was organic. And so I start drilling down, and the dumb old newsletter, if we're going to circumvent, social media traffic, SEO traffic, it's a highly engaged audience. Boston Globe supposedly has 30-plus newsletters aimed at their subscribers. News Corp Australia has 11. I drill down a little bit, and you say 4 or 5 passion subjects. If it's algorithmically built, I think they've got a National Rugby League newsletter. They've got a Letters to the Editor daily newsletter. What do we care how they or why they come in the front door or which door they come in? If that's the entry piece to the New York Times, God bless. My father's 87 years old. If there wasn't a daily obituary newsletter, he'd be in.
Question over here. I think we had one more.
I have a question about engagement. Y'all were talking about sustainability versus like clickbait. Like in TV news, I know anything crime-related, bloody on digital does really well. But I'm curious about your data on what you're seeing so far as to the stories that really will bring folks in for real memberships that aren't just clickbait, I guess.
What we found most helpful is habitual use. You're trying to get someone to be there 5, 10, 15 times a month. Newsletters are a very important part of that pathway. And sometimes it's real estate, sometimes it's crime, sometimes it's City Hall. The beauty of the meter is that you and sometimes it's obituaries. The beauty of the meter is it lets the reader decide what he or she finds most compelling. But it's this habitual, regular use. It's why service journalism, things like the 7-minute workout or whatever it is in the New York Times, the health coverage, these kinds of things, television coverage, which is big for you, create that kind of habit that triggers actual payment. Much more so than investigative news. Investigative news, though, is critical to the brand and critical to people's view of why they're paying.
Yeah, I would just say that there are just areas of passion. I think it's about tapping into passion points. It's not about a headline that just grips somebody. It's, people care about being healthy. They care about politics. They care about, wars and what's going on. I mean, it's, and you got to figure out the right angle for the audience to make sure that it's compelling to them. But these are real issues that I think, the thing that I find so exciting about where we are today is that these are things that before we felt like advertising was paying for, and that there were areas that were, kind of like really driving the business that were more kind of, I would call kind of ad generous. And actually, if you can nail the right news, that's the stuff people are really paying for. And it's about figuring out those passion areas.
It's also interesting that there can be some surprises when you start playing with content and understanding what people connect with. And one of the real surprises we had was that we started covering our local television news media, really just what the television stations are doing, and that is huge with audience.
And just one point, be true to your values. I don't think the New York Times coming up with a Kardashian story makes a lot of sense. Neither do I think that the National Enquirer should come up with food standards stories. So I'm just saying, let's not generalize, kind of what Sara was saying in her presentation earlier, let's not generalize about all media. You know, farm industry, popular media, quality media, local media, they all have their own unique thing, and just be true to the values.
I wanted to make a point to the gentleman's comment in the front row, and this kind of ends where you began, and that is that we do need to have direct contact and direct access to our own subscribers and our own readers through newsletters, through subscriptions, et cetera. But equally, most current and future readers are coming to us through Facebook, Google, increasingly through Snapchat, through aggregators like Apple News. And it's really up to us to play well with them and to take advantage of their genuine concern with what's happening in particular local media. Both Facebook and Google have very real initiatives with very real money and certainly real expertise devoted to the notion of how to get people to subscribe to local news. It's in their interest because it's in their interest to keep this ecosystem healthy enough to keep their platforms healthy. But they're not only a threat, they're also an enormous opportunity. And the better we can interact and integrate with them, the better off we'll all be.
Hey, last question.
Yeah, Katie Camp, Cox Media Group, Orlando. So I am on the broadcast side of things, just TV and radio. But I was wondering, this question is actually more for Earl. When you talk about paid subscriptions, where do you see that going for broadcast digital?
Everything is merging together. I think in 10 years, what's the difference between broadcast, digital, magazine media, newspaper media? It's all really coming together. I'm no expert on broadcast. I know that at the end of the day, it is about brand love. And if your news brand or your entertainment brand is not loved, you're not going to get the loyal people to pay you money. If your mission is not aligned with that, you will not succeed in this new world that Spotify and Netflix, to some degree, is doing the blocking and tackling for us right now. That's a broad answer. I'm happy to talk with you later in the break, but that's my broad answer.
I think you're going to have as long as political advertising and retransmission dollars are going into local television stations, they're not going to need that extra revenue. And because there's going to be 3 and 4 competitors at least in every market, nobody's going to be the first one to put a meter up on their site in their market. So I think it's easily 5 to 7 years away before you'll see any mass adoption of meters by local news broadcaster, television broadcasters. My opinion. Okay, I know we're out of time. Thank you for our panel. Thank all of you all for being here. Thank all of you all.